Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about the use of proxy miniatures in games where figure ranges come with a set of rules. So a slightly different setup this week, again just simply because my room's a mess. I can't be bothered to move everything around, and I'm just going to wing it and see what happens today. So is it ethical to use proxy miniatures instead of official figured ranges for historical Wargames rules? Or is this more of a concern for, or a matter of controversy if you like, for Wargames companies that produce non-historical games? I'm thinking here primarily of Games Workshop. Now and again I can be found lurking in online Wargames forums, seeking inspiration for topics to discuss here on this channel. And one such topic that I've seen come up time and again, which often seems a fairly contentious subject, is the use of proxy miniatures for official games. But until now I've considered this to be a Games Workshop problem. But am I being overly simplistic in my view of this debate, and is it becoming a topic discussed by historical wargamers as well? So historical wargaming in general has for a long time been a hobby where the participants buy a set of rules from a publisher and then source their miniatures themselves, usually from another company, sometimes multiple companies. You know, ranges are very rarely completely comprehensive, so it's not unusual to be buying a load of figures from this manufacturer and a load of figures from that manufacturer, and providing they're roughly the right size, you can use them for your games. But in recent years we've seen more and more rules being published alongside official miniature ranges, and as this trend has evolved, so has the debate about the use of proxy miniatures in historical games. So by proxy miniatures I mean models from other manufacturers or 3D printed alternatives, rather than the official range that comes with a set of rules. Now, are there ethical considerations when using proxies, particularly when companies release both rules and miniatures? It's a complex subject, maybe not one that comes up on many people's radar. But I read something very recently in Wargame Soldiers and Strategy that made this subject leap to the top of my mind again, and it was an article by Rick Priestley in this month's Wargame Soldiers and Strategy, where he was writing about trying to publish a set of rules of his own that he thought might have a very small print run. But he made a comment in there about rules and miniature ranges. So I'll read it out for you. So in the commercial world, fantasy and sci-fi games are typically designed to support sales of model ranges and built around specific intellectual property. They don't stand alone. Now, as someone who's come from that Games Workshop background, and a giant in the industry, that was an interesting phrase. It's just one sentence in the middle of a paragraph, but it said what I understand, which is that sometimes the rules themselves are not going to turn a profit. It's the whole package. So a company would invest in the machinery and the technology, the tooling, if you like, to make a set of models that's going to go with a set of rules, and combined they make a commercially viable product that they can then put out. Now obviously companies like Games Workshop make gazillions, maybe not gazillions, but they're not hard up. But their entire business model revolves around selling rules and selling miniatures to go with those rules, and so they defend that IP passionately. Let's put it that way. Let's be generous and call it passionately. So all of the demo games and tournaments that they run, they insist on their figure ranges, and it has to be official models and all the rest. Well, obviously as a private wargamer you may decide to use alternatives or proxy miniatures instead of the official range of figures. But of course there's a lot of pressure to use the official range of figures. But as I said in the introduction, for years I thought this was a Games Workshop problem, the sort of thing that only applied to sci-fi and fantasy games by some of the larger companies, where they have very clearly produced a set of rules and a set of miniatures to go with it, and maybe a large infrastructure that is constantly producing new figures and so on, and where there's usually where there's a vibrant tournament scene to support that game, so official figures are used, and of course that spills out to gamers outside of that tournament scene, so that everyone who plays that game ends up using the official range of figures. But of course we now live in an age where it's so much easier to print your own set of figures, to self-publish rules, and even within the historical wargaming community, we're seeing companies who are starting to produce, or have been for many years now, producing starter sets that include a set of rules and official figures that go with it. Now, I can't comment on whether that has fed into a vibrant tournament scene, because I'm not part of it. I would love to hear from you if you think that there is an emphasis on using official figures for sets of rules in tournament games, and has that spilled over into the wider wargaming community that play that particular set of rules. And personally, I'm the sort of player that is quite happy to buy a set of rules, but then immediately divert from those rules, use a different scale, use different sets of figures, and buy figures from multiple companies. It's part of my enjoyment of building up an army. So for instance, the current project that I'm working on, the Retreat from Moscow project that I'm doing with Ray, I bought figures from Perry's, Wargames Foundry, a group in Bisa, they're the frontline figures. I've got some Steve Barber models, so there's a range of figures that I can call upon to find just the right figure for my project. I'm missing a particular figure or a particular commander, or something, or particular option of unit, for instance. I can find somebody amongst those manufacturers and wider still that I can then use with the set of rules that we've decided to play, which is sharp practice by the Two Fat Lardies. Now, of course, TFL, they make a point of saying they only produce the rules. They don't do figure ranges to go with their rules. So you can do exactly what I'm suggesting. You can buy figures from multiple companies, or you can 3D print, or whatever the options are, whatever way you want to fulfill and use that game, that set of rules. But as I say, there are ranges, there are rules coming out now with their own unique scales that go with official figure ranges. So it'd be interesting to know whether you think that the use of proxy miniatures is frowned upon in those particular communities, those subsets of historical wargamers. I think it has to be said as well that for historical wargaming, where figures are often generic representations of historical troops rather than a unique intellectual property owned by the company that's produced the rules, different manufacturers, the use of 3D printing offers an appealing alternative for gamers who've got a set of rules and want to fulfill and build their armies. Some players argue that 3D printing is simply an evolution of traditional conversion work, where players modify miniatures with green stuff or kit bashing. Others, however, see it as a direct challenge to the traditional business model of games producers and miniature manufacturers when they go together like that. Now, of course, the issue of pirated miniatures is a separate subject entirely and extends way beyond 3D printing. The recasting of metal and resin miniatures has been a long-standing problem in the wargaming industry. Some individuals and companies illegally produce miniatures, either by making moulds of existing figures or by reverse engineering digital sculpts. Now, these pirated figures are then sold, obviously at a lower cost, undercutting legitimate manufacturers. And I suspect that most of you watching this video would reject that idea and would find that abhorrent. I would love to hear alternative points of view, of course. I'm quite open to discussing this topic. But it's another interesting aspect to this use of proxy miniatures. The options that are available to wargamers, both legitimate and illegitimate, are quite wide, I think, within the historical wargaming community, compared to, say, sci-fi or fantasy games, where you tend to be buying sets of rules that come very closely tied to official sets of figures. Of course, piracy in miniature wargaming is widely condemned by both companies and the majority of players, I think. While proxy usage and 3D printing involve a degree of ethical ambiguity, maybe, outright piracy, where an exact copy of a commercially available miniature is reproduced and sold without permission, is typically seen as unethical and illegal, of course. It directly harms legitimate businesses, discourages innovation and reduces the incentive for companies to produce new miniatures and rule sets. Of course, some players would attempt to justify piracy by citing high prices or limited availability, particularly when miniatures go out of production. However, these justifications do not change the fundamental legal issues involved. Unlike using third-party miniatures or 3D printed original designs, piracy does not contribute to the overall health of the hobby. Instead, devalues the work of sculptors, designers and manufacturers. Now, as I indicated in my introduction, the use of proxy miniatures and alternatives for historical rules is an issue that I've been aware of for a long time, but it's been largely contained within non-historical genres. So, let's be honest, I'm talking about Games Workshop mostly. But is this now becoming a problem for historical wargaming? Compared to other genres of tabletop wargaming, historical wargaming is generally more open to the use of proxy miniatures and alternative ranges. Many historical rule sets are designed specifically to be miniatures agnostic, meaning they can be played with figures from any manufacturer. And again, I cite the two Fat Lardies rules. This differs significantly from games like Warhammer 40,000, where official miniatures are strongly encouraged or even required for competitive play. Now, the historical wargaming community also tends to be more focused on historical accuracy rather than brand loyalty. Players often mix and match miniatures from different manufacturers to achieve the most accurate representations of historical forces, whereas in contrast, proprietary settings in fantasy or sci-fi wargaming create a stronger incentive for companies to control the miniatures used in their games, making proxy usage a greater point of contention. And as I mentioned earlier, not just in competition games where it's obligatory, but it spreads out into the wider wargaming community, the casual gamers who don't competition game but still tend to stick to the same principles as the rest of their community. Now, that said, some historical wargame companies do encourage players to buy official miniatures, particularly those that produce both rules and figures. Wargames, for instance, benefits from players using their miniatures for games like Bolt Action and Black Powder. However, strict enforcement of official figures appears to be rare, I would say, outside of company-sponsored events. As always, I'm not omnipotent here, I don't know entirely, so I would love to hear if you think differently about that, but that is my impression of the industry. So the use of proxy miniatures in historical wargaming is a nuanced issue with no real clear-cut answer. While players generally have greater freedom in choosing miniatures compared to those in proprietary sci-fi and fantasy settings, ethical considerations remain when companies release both rules and miniatures as a package. Does using alternatives break their business model? The rise of 3D printing further complicates the discussion, offering both legitimate and illicit means of acquiring miniatures. Piracy, however, is broadly condemned as unethical and as harmful to the industry that we love. Ultimately, historical wargaming thrives on its diversity, with many players prioritising historical accuracy, affordability and a variety of brand exclusivity. While companies have a right to protect their business interests, the community also values its long-standing tradition of flexibility in miniature choice. As technology evolves, the debate will no doubt continue, but the core of historical wargaming, recreating battles and sharing our love of history, will likely remain unchanged. So, as always, I would love to hear your opinions on today's subject. Are you for or against the use of proxy miniatures for new rules tied closely to figure ranges? Or are you much more open to the idea of adapting existing or alternative ranges to support a set of rules, bypassing the manufacturer's range entirely? And lastly, is this even a topic of heated debate amongst historical wargamers, or is this only really a contentious topic for Warhammer Games Workshop players? So that's it for this week. As always, please join the conversation in the comments below. I really do enjoy reading your feedback on my silly ramblings. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming and of course, keep rolling high.